we're going to move on now to next up, we have MARC to ArchivesSpace, Migrating Without Scripting. Your presenter is Sarah Newhouse from the Science History Institute, and I see Sarah has shared her screen. Before ArchivesSpace, all archival collections at the Science History Institute's Othmer library were described in Library Catalog Sierra with at least a MARC record and potentially either an attached PDF or Microsoft Word document of some additional description, so box and folder lists, inventories, etc. And they had varying adherence to standards. Science History Institute started using ArchivesSpace in 2017, but only used it to create EAD-compliant PDF finding aids, which were then attached to MARC records in the library catalog following previous practice. The Digital Preservation Archivist position was created in 2021, with one of its immediate goals being turning on and using the ArchivesSpace PUI for public finding aid access. As part of that process, SHI wanted to make the PUI the one-stop shop for all archival collections, which meant transporting over decades of MARC records from the Sierra Library Catalog into ArchivesSpace. This talk will describe this migration project, including the kinds of data cleanup that had been done, troubleshooting tips, impacts on processing and description workflows, access considerations, and what tools were used, notably not the API. So with that, I'll turn things over to Sarah.
Great, thank you. This presentation has actually changed a lot since the proposal, so I think I'm no longer really discussing processing and description workflows, but if you have questions about those, please do ask. Hi, I'm Sarah Newhouse, the Digital Preservation Archivist at the Science History Institute, where I'm responsible for Born Digital Archives collections, AV materials and digitization, and ArchivesSpace administration. The Science History Institute is a small nonprofit in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with a museum and a library that collect and share the stories of innovators and scientific discoveries that shape our lives. We preserve and interpret the history of chemistry, engineering, and the life sciences. Our library contains modern print volumes, periodicals, rare books, oral histories, and has about 600 accessible archives collections. These range from papers of chemical and scientific instrument companies to papers of individual scientists and scientific professional organizations. The library has an online catalog available at othmerlib.sciencehistory.org, which runs on a system called Sierra, produced by Innovative Interfaces. In 2022, because of a host of reasons, we had archives collections split across two public discovery platforms, Sierra and the ArchivesSpace PUI, which lives at archives.sciencehistory.org. So the goal of this project was to get all of the finding aids in one place, or all of the archival collection descriptions in one place, so that archives researchers could just search one database for all of our archival accessible collections. This project began very ambitiously. I initially wanted to use scripting to do the heavy lifting after ingesting new resource records into ArchivesSpace. I thought, what a great chance to really take the time to dive into our data, to clean it up, to get to know the ASpace API and learn some Python. And then I fell down really hard at the first hurdle. As a prerequisite for doing anything with the API, I needed to work with our actual data with all of its works, and I needed a safe place to mess it up. Our instance of ArchivesSpace is hosted, so while I do have access to the API, we do not have a testing or a staging server. So my plan was to install ASpace on a sandbox on a laptop that I could use to take some baby steps into the API and Python scripts. But unfortunately, after spending weeks on it and with some help from some IT colleagues, I could not get the sandbox to run. And so, frustrated and having wasted quite a bit of time with no visible results, I decided to just get the most out of the tools I was already familiar with, which were XML, XPath, and the ArchivesSpace staff user interface. So it was clear that our process was going to be, with or without the API, get MARC out of Sierra, mess with the MARC to get it into a format that ArchivesSpace likes, import the data into ArchivesSpace, and then probably some post-import cleanup. The real change with deciding not to use the API is just that now a lot of my data cleanup was front-loaded so that I could use XPath and spreadsheets and other tools instead of editing the data in bulk after it had been ingested. Step one was the easiest step of this whole process. Our technical services librarian got me a full MARC export of all of the records in Sierra that had the location archives. This export was one .mrc MARC file that contained all of the records for all of these collections. But ASpace does not accept a .mrc file as an import. So I used MARC Edit, which is an amazing little free piece of software that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And I use that to transform all 500 some MARC records into MARC XML, and to split those records up, or to split that one MARC record up into individual MARC XML files. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but transforming your MARC records from vanilla MARC to MARC XML will look something like this. So here's a regular MARC record straight from Sierra. If you're not familiar with MARC, the important thing is that the MARC fields don't have names. They have 3-digit numbers, which are on the left, and then the field content is on the right. And here's a MARC XML file. This is for a different collection, but all of the data is here. And the MARC field numbers are now tags, which are appearing in orange, inside of MARC data field elements, which are in blue. And here's a direct example of the same field in 2 different formats. This is MARC field 245, which is one MARC field that contains 2 subfields, an A and an F, that hold the title and the date. So you can see how in the original MARC, subfields are declared by a $ followed by a letter, while in MARC XML, the subfields are broken out into their own XML elements. At this point, it's good to note that if you want to do a project like this, you will need to spend some time just getting familiar with your data and running some test imports to see where the issues are and what looks weird. And you should also get familiar with the MARC mapping guide that ArchivesSpace provides, which tells you where all of these MARC fields go in an ArchivesSpace resource record. Or alternately, they tell you which ArchivesSpace fields are pulled from which MARC fields. This is very, very important. The largest cleanup task I did was removing a lot of trailing punctuation from title, date, and publication fields. And anyone doing a MARC migration will probably have to do this too, because well-formed, correct MARC should contain punctuation, but we don't want that in our finding aids. So looking at the MARC XML for this title field again, you can see that subfield 245A, which will become the title, ends with a comma after the word kit. And subfield 245F, which will become the date expression, ends with a period. And that both pieces of punctuation are there in the original MARC at the top. So to remove all of the punctuation from literally every XML file, I used 2 tools, Oxygen XML Editor and XPath. Oxygen XML Editor can be pricey, but it's a program I was familiar with, and it has the great advantage of letting you treat a directory as a project, and then being able to run actions on all of the files in that project or directory. XPath is a language specifically designed for searching and pointing to specific places and elements in an XML document. And this isn't an XPath tutorial, so I'm not going to get too deep into this, but I will show you one example of an XPath query that is the one I used to get rid of trailing punctuation. So we know XML is hierarchical. The elements are nested inside of elements, and XPath uses that to help narrow in on the one specific thing you are looking for. So this query at the top, of the screen is telling Oxygen to look within MARC collection for MARC record, and for MARC record elements that specifically contain data fields that are tagged as MARC field 245. And every time it finds a MARC field 245, it's going to check to see if it contains a subfield F, which remember is the field of our date expression. So if you run this query on every file in a project, it will give you every field that contains a date in every XML file. It gives you all of the MARC XML that eventually will become the ArchivesSpace date expression for every collection. In Oxygen, you do this by typing XPath queries into a bar at the top left of the screen. You specify that you want it to run across all of the files in a project, and you hit enter. And it will give you a list at the bottom of the screen containing all of the times that the element you're looking for appears in your project. You can then open the files from this list at the bottom, and the thing that you're looking for will be highlighted in the main window. But here's the really nice thing about using XPath and Oxygen. You can combine it with find and replace. So you can tell Oxygen not just to go get all of the 245F elements, aka the date expression. You can tell it, go find all of the 245F fields, and when you do, check to see which ones contain a period next to a right angle bracket. which is how punctuation at the end of a field value will appear in XML. And then you can also tell Oxygen to replace all of those period plus angle brackets with just an angle bracket, effectively removing the period. And once you run this, you have now eliminated the period from the end of every date expression in every collection in about 15 seconds. So this is just one example, but I hope you can tell it's a pretty powerful tool for working with XML at scale without doing any additional scripting or learning any extra stuff. And you can combine XPath and find and replace to search for all kinds of different things you might want to change in your data before ingesting it into ArchivesSpace. Other changes I made using XPath, in addition to removing the trailing punctuation, I also deleted all the data in MARC 246 fields, which might be a little controversial, but for us, this data contained alternate titles that were often duplicates or near duplicates of the titles that were already in the 245 MARC field, or they were just information we didn't want to keep, like the papers of David Bowie being an alternate title for the David Bowie papers. I also spent a good chunk of time staring at and trying different tactics to clean up our extent fields, which is the 300 field in MARC, but ultimately our extent data was pretty inconsistent across collections, and it would have been very difficult to clean this up in a way that did not just make things worse. So going back to some XML, this is the way our extent data breaks out in the MARC XML. You can see 4 subfields under the 300 field, subfields A and F, which repeat in this record. A is always used for a numerical value, and F is always a unit of measurement. This record describes one box containing one manual, and this is how it appears in the SUI. So we have 1 parens, 1 open parens, box manual, close parens, close paren. And some of our data also looks like this. 3 open parens, 1.8 open parens, boxes linear feet, close paren, close paren. And some of it looks like this, completely different parenthetical arrangement. So as of today, the way the 300 MARC field imports into ArchivesSpace extent fields is actually under review by the Metadata Standards Subcommittee, and I wish them a lot of luck. And one last data-centric issue I want to point out for folks who might be considering a similar project is that you need to get very familiar with the MARC 008 field. This is a field up at the top of your XML document that will look to a non-cataloger, like a random string of numbers, letters, and white spaces or backslashes. ArchivesSpace pulls a couple of important fields from 008, like the language of the collection and both dates and a date range. And it's very possible for this data to cause problems without you noticing. For example, during my work in this migration, I was bouncing between a few different XML editors and different versions of Oxygen. And at some point, one of those editors helpfully removed all of the extra white space in my XML documents. This is a problem because the 008 field is a string of numbers, letters, and white spaces, and each of those spaces means something. So when ArchivesSpace wants to know what language a collection is in, it will look at positions 35 to 37 of this field. So when you remove the white space, the language code is no longer in positions 35 to 37, and ArchivesSpace rejects the import. So this example here, spaces 35 to 37 contain the letters FRE, and this collection is in French. Here is a 008 field in line 10 without white space, which I did not notice until I tried to import something and then realized this had happened to all of my documents. And here it is with the white space. It should look like this. But alas, I couldn't think of a way to easily replace the white space free fields with the fields containing the white space. So I did replace all of these by hand, but it was actually worth it because in learning about the 008 field, I also learned there were other peculiarities in our data that had to be adjusted by hand. Like the letter in the 6th position must be only an I, a K, or an S, but other letters are allowed and do appear in MARC records. They just need to be replaced before ArchivesSpace ingest. So again, this isn't bad MARC. It's just the way that ASpace likes to translate MARC. Or in some of our records, the dates in the 008 field are different than the dates in the 245F title field, which means you end up with different dates in the date expression and the date range fields in ArchivesSpace. So eventually data cleanup was done, but there was one last surprise for us. Incorrect, missing, and duplicate accession numbers. This isn't really a data thing, but I wanted to mention it as both a difficulty and a blessing of this migration project. We had to dig back into donor files, assign new numbers in some cases, and sometimes reconstitute collections that had been scattered across multiple MARC records, all because ASpace requires each collection to have an ID and for that ID to be unique. We spent a lot of time on this, but it was really worthwhile just for intellectual control over our collections. And this is the anticlimactic part. Then you ingest your files. I used ArchivesSpace's background job to import MARC XML bibliographic data to create resource records. You can do hundreds at a time, I think. I did small batches to make troubleshooting easier, and there were, of course, still weird one-off issues that I had to go into the XML to fix, even on the final import. And now the long tail of post-ingest cleanup is happening. Although at this point, most of the things on this slide are done. There were a few ASpace records that needed external links to be added manually. A couple of records needed hyperlinks to point back to the collection in Sierra because there was extra inventory information in a PDF attached to that record. And migrating that data from the PDF into ASpace was not part of this project, but we wanted to make sure people could still find it from ArchivesSpace. Cleaning up agents and subjects is really the big time suck here. This migration project left us with a lot of duplicate agents and subjects. And unfortunately, I think you do still need a human to look at your agent records to make sure that this Don Othmer is the same as that Don Othmer, who is the same as Donald Othmer, and merge them all together. And this is undoubtedly the most time-consuming part of the cleanup. And I do think now, after having done this, that there are probably ways to sort through your MARC XML to thin your agents out a bit. But at the time, I was also comfortable deferring this until after import. And let's see. Oh, and there's some date weirdness that I'm pretty sure came from the 008 field, but that's pretty easy to catch and fix as we encounter it. So lessons I can pass along to someone else who wants to follow this process. You will have to be familiar with 3 different data models, not just one: MARC, ArchivesSpace, the ArchivesSpace data model, and the ArchivesSpace JSON data model. The first 2 might be obvious, but I was really surprised by how much I ended up working with and needing to fully understand MARC. And the JSON was also a surprise, but being familiar with ArchivesSpace resource records and how they appear in JSON is incredibly helpful for troubleshooting error messages on import. Because when you try to import something and you get an error message, it's going to tell you where that error is by pointing you to a specific space in the JSON. Second thing you should be aware of is just that this is iterative, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. Inevitably, you will think you found everything, and then you're going to run a test import or open a random file, and you're going to find something new, like realizing some of your collections don't have accession numbers. So get comfortable, get your hands in the data, and settle in for a while. And lastly, something else I'm sure we all know: the perfect is the enemy of the good here. Early on, we decided we wanted our data to be accurate, but that some level of messiness was fine. And this was a really helpful guide rail when I started to get too in the weeds on, say, updating all of the node labels to be the same. If it won't get in the way of our users understanding our records, it's probably fine for now. And I want to end with a massive thank you to Celia Coast-Ellenbogen at Swarthmore and Julie Swerzek at the Folger, who drafted an article about this exact process back in 2018, never published it anywhere, but graciously sent me a copy after I complained to Celia about this project. If you would like to see their paper, which they've agreed to share with anyone who's interested, please email me. And also thank you to various folks on the ASpace member list and the Archivist Working with Archival Data Slack channel who answered many, many questions. And thank you for attending. Please let me know what questions you have, and please do email me if you'd like to talk about this more.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, that was great. We already have a question in the chat, so I'll read that one out loud. But if there are any other questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A. And anytime I say chat, assume I mean Q&A. Could you please repeat or clarify the work you're doing to clean up extents? I heard that they were under review by the metadata subcommittee, but I think I missed some information.
Yeah, that is a great question. The only reason I know they're under review is because that information is in the ArchivesSpace mapping spreadsheet. I don't know what that committee is doing or how that process is going, but I imagine it's very complicated. The cleanup for the extents, unfortunately, is manual because our data is so varied in terms of what was in the MARC for extent info that I really struggled with this, but I could not figure out a way to programmatically manipulate our extent data to make it look good in ArchivesSpace. Just the parentheses made things way too complicated, and I wasn't really sure what was happening on the inside with how the data was being changed when it went into ASpace. So yeah, it's manual. That's not a great answer, and I'm sorry.
Thanks, Sarah.
Mhm.
Christine dropped into the chat a link to the JIRA issue related to metadata standards extent discussion. So
Thank you.
Bree, be sure to check that out. And yeah,
Mhm.
that is in the chat. Bree says, thanks, we're in the thick of extent cleanup as well.
Yeah, it's a mess.
All right, any other questions? We do have a few minutes, so we'll pause here. All right, not seeing any other Q&A. I'm talking very slowly in case anyone is typing. All right, not seeing any other questions. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that presentation. That was really great. Feel free to stop sharing your screen whenever you want, but thank you so much.